We continue our talk about the four temperaments and knowing who we are. These temperaments are important to understand who we are, but also working on the virtues and vices that hinder us from growing in holiness. Christian perfection requires us to work on these temperaments so we can become a better father, mother, husband, wife, manager, and employee. Hello everyone, today's episode is about how to truly know ourselves by using St. Thomas's temperaments as described by Father Marin. We continue our discussion with the phlegmatic temperaments and how all of these temperaments play out in the family and at work, as well as using our temperaments to build on our journey to holiness called perfection.
Welcome to another episode of Practical Catholic with David Cease. Practical Catholic is a spiritual coaching show to help you find peace, love, and joy in family and work life. We are here each and every week to help you grow spiritually, to become successful in this life, and to be a saint for the life after.
My story begins, I want to say back almost 10 years ago. I had hired a person to kind of be my CEO, and he brought in this idea of these personality traits. And by this time I had managed many people. I was in the Marines, and then I was, being able to run a business. Now, in the Marines, we are taught how to lead people. We don't really even talk about temperaments in the Marines. We really talk about molding and mentoring and shaping people, and then leading them. Okay, so I guess how we look at it is that let the past be the past, but we're here to make Marines. In fact, there's a big sign in boot camp that says, "We make Marines." When you enter Parris Island, South Carolina, that's what it says. We make Marines. All right. We don't care what your temperament is. We don't care about what it is. We want to make sure that we train you and harness the power of whatever your temperament is to become a Marine. So, and when you're in Parris Island, you see all these different various people, some slow, some fast, some witty, some not, some smart, some not so smart. But we all come together to fulfill a mission. And each one of us actually had a certain greatness to ourselves that we contributed to the platoon, regardless of our temperaments, regardless of whatever. So this was the mentality of the Marines. So I'm coming in from a standpoint that in the Marines, we mold people, we shape them, and we build them to be what they are, and then you harness their powers. And the military has that luxury, right? They have an infinite supply of money in some cases, so that they can spend 3 months, or longer to train them. They say that IBM trains their salespeople for 6 months. I don't have 6 months to train my guys here at work, and so but there's this idea that there's these personality traits, and you should study these personality traits. So when this person came along and described to me these personality types, I said, I might as well give it a try, because he convinced me that these personality traits are very important. And so I said, okay, let's try it. So we incorporated in our recruitment process what they call the Myers-Briggs personality tests. And so it's basically a group of questions that you answer, and they come out and they say, boom, this is the type of personality that you have, and these are the qualities that you have, some here, some there. And I was pretty impressed. I was like, wow, this is pretty neat, because certain job titles require certain types of qualities that others don't need or whatever. So if there were a salesperson, they might need a great ability to call people and to communicate effectively and be persistent in that call. And so this test kind of said this is the type of personality that they have, and this is their behaviors that they're going to have. And so I was like, wow, this is great. This is, so much easier to try to recruit and find people of that nature. So we hired the people based off their test that this is what it is. Yet I don't think anyone that I hired through that process really were good people, and I eventually would fire them. And why is that? Why is it that this test didn't work out the way that I did? And quite frankly, if you actually ever study it, people like, I think there was a study within Google, which employs a lot of people. They said there really isn't a way to figure out. There's no perfect science. I mean, even the Myers-Briggs test don't work. I mean, at the end of the day, what matters the most is what are you doing for me, right? And doing that. But why do the Myers-Briggs don't work? Because the one thing that Myers-Briggs doesn't do is it doesn't test two qualities that I don't know how you can measure outside of actually hiring them and working with them and giving them other things. The first is, how much virtue do they have? Okay? Just because they have this boldness, these qualities, okay? If they don't have humility, if they don't have boldness, if they don't have drive, then all of their capabilities that this Myers-Briggs test says that they have really can't be applied to your job. That's what I was finding, right? So maybe they were, had this great quality of communicating, but they didn't have this quality of how to communicate my software or my services, right? They were used to just talking in simple terms because their intellectual capabilities weren't there, right? And they weren't bold enough and they weren't humble enough to sit down and say, this is what we're trying to sell. This is my services. These are my products. This is what it is. Or maybe they were analytical, okay? But because they were over-analytical, they never got anything done, all right? Because they were so afraid of making decisions or so afraid of doing anything, So it was really, they didn't show me, were they humble? Were they bold? Were they drive? Did they have ownership? Were they problem solvers? This is something that Myers-Briggs doesn't show. And so because of that, I'd hire them for their qualities, but their qualities couldn't be leveraged to what I needed them to be used for. Okay? That was problem number one. And that's why it didn't work. Problem number two was the fact that it doesn't test their ultimate reliability, their personal problems that they had. So you might have this wonderful guy that comes in and all the great traits, but between all his baggage or her baggage of personal problems, they weren't good workers. They weren't reliable workers. Calling in sick, calling in, I have this problem, that problem, everything else. And so as a small business, you're kind of going, wow, you're really unreliable, okay? And your true trustworthiness isn't there. This is something that Myers-Briggs doesn't check out. So it's great and wonderful to understand people's traits, okay, and their temperaments. But what really matters the most, and I fell back to the Marine Corps way, is did they have the virtues? Because any type of qualities that someone has, and that includes even the temperaments, can only be leveraged and empowered when virtue, fortitude, strength, perseverance, all these things, humility of all of them, okay, can be leveraged to, they have those virtues, so those qualities can be leveraged. That's really the most important. And I've hired many, many people here that have these various temperaments, but they were able to be productive because they were humble, they were bold, they had drive, they have ownership, and they were able to problem solve. And those are things of virtue. That's what they are, which personality traits makes irrelevant. Okay? So we're going to talk about the last temperament called the phlegmatic temperament. And this temperament we're going to go over. And then after that, we're going to see what happens with these temperaments in life and how they play out in life at work, at family, and as a person. And what do we need to do to strive for that? So let's continue. We've already talked about the sanguine. We talked about the choleric, and we already talked about the melancholic. So let's talk about the phlegmatic, all right? And these people are identified as very relaxed and peaceful, okay? They're what I would call the thinkers or the analyzers, okay? So the phlegmatic. The phlegmatic, let me see if I can find it. All right. Okay. The phlegmatic temperament. The phlegmatic is rarely aroused emotionally, and if so, only weakly. The impressions received usually last for only a short time and leave no trace. Okay. So emotionally speaking, they're hard to move emotionally. So you can't do guilt treatments. You can't do, they're not going to watch a great movie or, with emotionalism or anything like that. So they have weak impressions when it comes to emotions. And if that happens, it's very short lasting. The good characteristics of the phlegmatic persons are these. He works slowly, but assiduously. Yes, assiduously. This is very important to understand. He is not easily irritated by insults, misfortunes, or sickness. Okay? So they're that, the little train that could, chugga, kind of a personality type. He usually remains tranquil, discreet, and sober. Okay? They're very sobering. They work very, diligently. When they do work, they think a lot, and then when they do it pretty accurately and pretty easily. He has a great deal of common sense and mental balance. Okay. He does not possess the inflammable passions of the sanguine temperament, the deep passions of the melancholic temperament, or the ardent passions of the choleric temperament. In his speech, he is orderly, clear, positive, and measured, rather than florid and picturesque. He is more suited to scientific work, which is the fruit of long and patient research and minute investigation, than to original productions. So they're very big researchers. You can see why St. Thomas Aquinas is the perfect example of the phlegmatic. You can see him just in his little cell, or his room, we would call it, and writing and thinking and pondering and analyzing. And St. Thomas is one of my favorite saints. Most of my spiritual ideas actually come from him. Clear example is I'm going over the 4 temperaments that he devised. Actually, he had more, but this is the summarization by Father Marin, who's also Dominican. So the Dominicans are the are that fit this type of temperament very well. He has a good heart, but it seems to be cold. These people, like the melancholic. This one is really, really misunderstood, okay? Because they seem very cold-hearted, because they're non-emotional. But they have a very genuine good heart. They really do. And it's a very beautiful heart in many cases. But it seems cold just because they're just very immovable. They're kind of like the slug, You wouldn't think of hugging a slug or a sloth. But they actually have a very good. They're very genuine, people. He would sacrifice to the point of heroism if it were necessary, but he lacks enthusiasm and spontaneity because he is reserved and somewhat indolent by nature. So by nature, he's not going to be spontaneous. Okay, he's not going to be enthusiastic. Okay, so you kind of picture a sanguine being married to a phlegmatic. That's kind of the sanguine is like all emotional and upbeat and wants to dance all the time, and then you got this phlegmatic that's just kind of okay, very slow, with no spontaneity and no enthusiasm. It's kind of funny. He is prudent, sensible, reflexive, and works with a measured pace. He attains his goals without fanfare or violence because he usually avoids difficulties rather than attacking them. This is really important. Rather than attacking problems, he would rather avoid the problems. This is what a phlegmatic does, okay? He'd rather avoid it than to tackle them. Physically, the phlegmatic is usually of robust build, slow in his movements, and has an amiable face. St. Thomas Aquinas seems to have possessed the best qualities of the phlegmatic temperament. They're like a sloth. Sloths are pretty big and they're kind of cute and slow. Okay, so if that was the animal that you would use, that's the phlegmatic animal that you would want to use. All right. The defects of the phlegmatic. Here's some defects. The defects qualities of phlegmatic temperament are as follows. Their slowness and calmness cause these persons to lose many good opportunities because they delay so long in putting works into operation. They are slow. Very, 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 very slow. And, I've had to actually, I have one employee that I had to actually, fire because he was slow, and he was a prime example of a phlegmatic. But as a business owner, there has to be a kind of a bare minimum of work productivity. It wasn't like he was goofing off. It wasn't like he was, doing some bad or evil acts. He was just slow. And so productivity, at some sense, has to be done with speed. So what people could do normally at his pace, at a normal amount of hours, his pace, he was only doing a third of productivity. So they're slow, and they lose their opportunities. Okay, and this gentleman lost his opportunity of working for our company. They are not too interested in events that take place around them, but rather tend to live by and for themselves, almost to the point of egoism. So it's almost like a narcissistic behavior, okay? They think of themselves. These are people you can't do guilt treatment. Sanguine people, you can guilt treat them, okay? But these people, they just think of themselves. Not because they're selfish. They're self-centered, okay? Which is not to be confused with selfishness, okay? Self-centered just means that they're worried about the world around them. That's what they are. They are not suitable for government and administration. I would have to disagree with this a little bit in a sense that if you look at government, they are kind of slow. I mean, if you see the movie Zootopia, there's a scene where the DMV, it's the slugs who are running the DMV. I think what he's saying is that you're never going to see phlegmatics in leadership positions. You're never going to see them in even management positions. I do distinguish the difference between managers and leaders. Okay, leaders have great influence. Okay, as opposed to managers, they don't have great influence. They push buttons to make people go right. So, but I think that's what he's trying to get at in doing that. They are not usually drawn to corporal penance and mortification, as St. Teresa points out, and there is no fear that they will kill themselves by penance and self-abnegation. So doing any type of corporal penance and mortification, they're not going to do, or they will have no desire to do that. And most of the time, the reason why is because there has to be a high level of empathy. People who do corporal penances and mortification typically have a higher level of penance and, empathy because to do something like penance and mortification, it's really, the purpose of it is to do it for other people, even including yourself, whether you're doing it for God, whether you're doing it for salvation of souls. There's a reason, because no one in their right mind wants to do penance or mortification outside of doing it for other people, right? So they're not going to be very much attracted to that. They're not going to be doing that well. In extreme cases, they become so lethargic and insensible that they become completely deaf to the invitation or command that would raise them out of their stupor. Okay, so in extreme cases, they become very lethargic. Okay, and they can't get out of their stupor, which I totally agree with, because they are so slow. The phlegmatic can avoid the bad effects of his temperament if he is included with deep conviction and if he demands of himself methodical and constant efforts toward greater perfection. He will advance slowly, to be sure, but he will advance far. The beauty of the phlegmatic is that they are like the little engine that could. I think I can, and they, little by little, right, will do it. They are the turtles, okay, while the sanguines are the rabbits. So eventually the turtle will win because they can do it little by little. But here's the thing, and this is for all temperaments. You have to be convicted of the way of perfection. This is why Catholicism is so practical. If no one wants to seek perfection, then they live within their temperament. Okay, that's what happens, and we'll talk about this a little bit. But seeking that greater perfection and being convinced to do that will pull them out of these temperaments and will actually make them a better person, even in the secular world. Above all, he must not be allowed to become indolent and apathetic. That's the biggest pitfall, is they become apathetic and indolent, but should be directed to some lofty ideal, perfection, holiness, heaven. He too needs to gain control of himself, not as the choleric who must restrain and moderate himself, but to arouse himself and put his dormant powers to good use. So in other words, unlike the choleric who needs to control himself because he's overpowering, the phlegmatic needs to arouse himself to become powerful and become a doer. So that's what the phlegmatic needs to do. Okay, so let's talk about all the temperaments in general. Okay, generally speaking. So the first thing I want to kind of help you visualize about these temperaments that we have is we can use one-word statements. So for example, the sanguine, think of them as they're like the influencers. Okay, they have high empathy. They're passionate. They're great at influencing other people because of their high emotion, being able to be empathetic and adjust in what they say and do. But they burn out very quickly. They're a shooting star, and they burn out very quickly. Then you've got the melancholic. The melancholic are ponderers. They really have depth in what they think and how they think, and they ponder. What is this meaning? What does this mean? But their pondering tends to be in a negative terms, okay, in a negative way. The choleric, they're the doers. They do. That's their strength. Their weakness is they do without understanding, without truly, with a heart, with in some cases with no heart. And then the phlegmatic are the analyzers. They analyze. They think about what's going on, but thinking at the expense of doing, and they don't do. Now, here's the problem with our society, okay? Because our society does not emphasize seeking perfection, okay? Perfection comes from the Latin perfectio, which means to complete. Because if you notice, every single one of those temperaments they lack something, right? They lack, because our goal is really to have, to obtain the best quality of all four of those temperaments. The passion of a sanguine, right? The doer of the choleric. The depth of meaning of what are we doing of the melancholic. And then think and analyze and not just react like the phlegmatic. So at the end of the day, no one really knows what your personality type is because you've built enough virtue to bring the qualities of everything else. But what happens to us is that a society that does not value Christian values, like the virtues, okay, will do two things, okay? And this is what happens. The first is they become extremely myopic, okay? Their personality type become very, very myopic. Because they don't want to complete themselves in the process of perfection. All right, so that's one, is they become very, very, you get people like, oh, well, I'm just this way. That's all I am. Or the world makes them that way. The world likes that, the sanguine who is so passionate, right? That he's on social media and he says the craziest things and he does the things that get all people riled up, right? So now he becomes this myopic, influencer that has doing crazy things, right? Or you have this, this doer who is praised because he or she is a workaholic. And all they, just work. That's what they do. And now they're praised for doing that. So they kind of, fall under this. So if you don't seek perfection, all right, then the world will suck you in and either say you are what you are and I'm a melancholic, I'm this, I'm that, this, and that, and never want to change and never improve they are, because they all have flaws. Yes, they have strengths, they all have flaws. Or the world will suck you in and hyper extend and make your personality, your temperament, even more exasperated. And to the point where it will really, really dominate and cause you to, and at the end, not be good. So that's problem one. The second problem is that the world will say your temperament is better than everyone else's temperament. The sanguine will say, to let's say to the phlegmatic, you don't have a heart. You're so cold, right? And then, the doer will look at the sanguine and say, you don't get anything done. All you do is you just, are this passionate person. You start things and then you never finish anything, right? And then you've got the melancholic that everyone's like, oh, you're so depressing, look at me. I'm a doer. I get things done. Look at me. I'm a sanguine, and I'm so passionate. I have a heart, and I know how to read people. Or look at me. I think before I act because I'm phlegmatic, and I analyze and I think. Okay. Or I'm a melancholic, and I really know what the meaning of life is all about. So everyone thinks that their temperament is better than everyone else, and that's what it becomes. Okay? And you see it playing out in families, you see it playing out in work, rather than saying, you know what, I have this temperament, I need to work on it so that I can acquire the good traits of the other temperaments through the virtues. Okay? And you can see that. So let's envision this out, okay? You'll have, a lot of times the sanguine are good leaders. okay? And they will, or they're good salespeople, right? Because they're just crazy. They're the ones that are like, hey man, let's he can feel the people and he can talk to them and he can influence them, and he thinks he's great. But what I find that most people who are sanguine is you got to keep coaching them to get the job done. They're very high maintenance. Why are they high maintenance? Because you got to keep motivating them to just get their job done. That's what the sanguine people, that's what happens to the sanguine people. You have to keep motivating them because they have very short-lived passions. It's hard for them to keep doing the same job over and over and over and over and over again. And at the end of the day, all jobs, I don't care what it is boring because you can master it within 6 months. And if you're a sanguine person, you're going to get bored very easily. So they're very high maintenance because, you got to keep them entertained. You got to keep them doing all these things. So you have the melancholic, okay? Now, it's great to understand why we're doing this and the deep meaning behind certain things and doing that. But the problem with the melancholic is that they are always in a negative way. Well, why it can't work? I had a really good employee, and he was a melancholic type. And, he every day we would be driving. Well, David, why are we doing this? Isn't it? And he had this like extreme scrupulosity that in some ways made him good, developer and everything, but also made him bad. And I would tell him, I would say, let's say I called him Larry, and I said, Larry, you got to stop thinking. You got to stop thinking about this and not worry about it and get the job done. Well, and so there was a lot of scruples that were bothering him in that what was going on. And so they actually limit themselves. And I had to coach this person to become more optimistic, less thinking about the why and more into doing, okay? Because the whys were getting him more involved with making it perfect and all the other stuff going on. So that's how that played out with the melancholic. All right. I have the doers, which are the calorics. They're great, but the biggest problem with calorics is I call them high RPMs but low gear. So if you know anything about cars, what makes a car go fast and what makes a car go efficiently is a combination of RPMs, that's how fast the engine goes, and the gears. So the engine can go at, let's say, 8,000 RPMs, which is very fast. But if you only have it in first gear, then you're only going to go, 15 miles an hour. That's all you're going to go, right? But if you have 8,000 RPMs going in fifth gear, you're going to go wicked fast, okay? Very, very fast. So the big things about doers is that they do without really thinking. And when it happens, when I say thinking, really not knowing why they're doing it. And so they are doing all this effort for very little gain. Very, very. So they're efficient, but not effective. Effective here means that they are, that what their activity is really is achieving that goal, right? There's a saying that said, the airline pilot said, I have some good news and I got some bad news. And he goes, the good news is we're really making some really good time and we're going really fast. The bad news is we don't know where we're going. Okay. So if you don't know where you're going, then all your effort and doing is meaningless. Okay. So doers get caught into just doing rather than actually doing something that's effective. I had a person who was like that. And one day this person came along and he looked at me and he came to my office and he said, I want to show you something. So I go to his computer and he shows me his inbox. and there's nothing in his inbox. And I said to him, I said, what do you want to show me? He goes, look. And I said, what? He goes, there's not an email in my inbox. I said, oh, what is that supposed to prove to me? He goes, that's how efficient I am. And I'm looking at him going, so you've been spending all of this, the whole several weeks, just basically organizing your emails. And he said, yeah. And I said, you should actually be doing your job. Okay? So these are people who do without being effective. Okay? Now, so we got to be careful about that, right? You know, if the caloric, the doers, had a little bit of, you know, the melancholy of the why, okay, then maybe they would be more productive, right? It's not just doing without the why. Then you got the analyzers, and the analyzers are just extremely slow. Okay? At the end of the day, there has to be some productivity level, right? They're accurate in what they do. They're always perfect in what they do. If you tell a phlegmatic, if you tell a phlegmatic to do a certain thing, they will do it 100% accurate. And they will take the immense amount of time to make sure that they have done that accurately and perfectly. When most of the time the world just wants to, you know, get it done. All right, whether it's done 100% perfect or 90% perfect or even 85% perfect. They just need to get it done, right? So they're the ones that will make sure the paper's folded perfectly and evenly, as opposed to just folding it so they can put it in an envelope and mail it out. So, you know, that's how it plays out. And if virtue is not infused in these temperaments, then they're doomed to fail, okay? The phlegmatic won't become faster, okay? The doer won't be effective. The sanguine will not have enough stick-to-itivism or persistence to get the job done. They'll start everything but never finish it. And the melancholic will never get out of his negativity and why to get things done as well. So we need to analyze where we are, build virtue, so that we can acquire the good attributes of the other temperaments. And, you know, the way that you do that is seeking perfection. This is probably the biggest improver of everyone, is seeking perfection, okay? We read so many self-help books, you know, like, you know, how to become this, how to become that, and all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, it's not self-help books that we do. Because, you know, I could be a person that reads a self-help book on how to be organized. But if I'm sanguine, I'm going to read it. I'll maybe do it for like a week, and then I'll give up on it. I'm like, forget it. You know, I try to be organized, and I can't be organized anymore, right? Because the sanguine is passionate. Like, I got to get organized. And then it'll burn out. So the issue isn't seeking a self-help book. The first issue is seeking perfection. The Catholic Church is seeking perfection, which comes from the Latin perfectio, which means to complete ourselves, because there are certain things that we're lacking. And so we need to see and seek those virtues that completes us, that helps us acquire the good attributes of these other temperaments, because these other temperaments do have good attributes. So that's why perfection is really, really practical here on earth. But more importantly, it's actually important because it's the way to become holy, which we need to be to get to heaven. And not only are we using natural virtues, but because we're seeking perfection and holiness, God's grace will actually help us along that way. because grace does perfect nature. So where we're a little rough in, grace will help us out. So, wow. So perfection is actually so practical in the earthly sense. It's practical in the everlasting sense. And it also allows God to work on us and give us the supernatural graces to help us out become perfect. Okay? So, it's that's how powerful it is, So all we need to do is seek perfection. And there are so many books on seeking perfections. There are so many books on it. There's great saints about it. And little by little, you gain that way. All right? So, we have to understand first what temperament we are. Okay? What God has given us, and why would God give us these deficiencies? Why didn't He just make us perfect at the get-go? Why do we have these deficiencies? Mainly because these deficiencies are there to make us a saint. That's what they're there for, to make us a saint. And how? Because we know we have these deficiencies. We offer them up to God. And then eventually we work on them little by little. That's what great saints did. Okay? They worked on every single one of these temperaments, on their temperaments, and improved on what they were. Okay? That's what makes them a saint. They weren't a saint because they were just this way. If you look at all the great saints, they had to work on perfection because that's the only way they became a saint. If you look at St. Francis is a clear example of a sanguine, a very passionate person. He was influential. But he knew he had to have a form of dedication. So he had to become more of a doer. He had to become more of a thinker. All right? So you look at St. Thomas Aquinas, who's a classic example of phlegmatic. But he didn't spiral into a nothingness. He wrote tons and tons of works. Summa Theologica, okay? That book is not small, okay? It's a huge book, and it has a lot of great insights. For being a phlegmatic who's not a doer, that work in itself is huge, right? And not only that, but he had to have, read tons and tons of articles about Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. And think about this. Summa Theologica means the summation of theology. Okay? So he had to have studied all of these things. So he became a doer. He certainly became a doer. All right? So he wasn't just sitting there and going, woe is me. All right? And he had a certain level of passion. Okay? His passion was making God known. That's why he did that. That's why he wrote the Summa Theologica. That's why he reconciled Aristotelian philosophy with theology. One of the things that he wrote, which is a great book, all right, hard to read, but it's not long. It's only like 60 pages, is called On a Being and an Essence. All right. And it's a summation, I would call it a summation on metaphysics. And, the reason why he wrote this book was because when he was the chair of University of Paris, which is now called University of Paris, it was a Catholic university at the time, all of his fellow brothers, his fellow friars said to St. Thomas Aquinas, if there was only one thing we had to learn and know, what would it be? And so he wrote this short little book, again, 60 pages, very small. 8.5 by 11 is probably only like 30 pages. And he wrote it. Now, here's a phlegmatic who has very little empathy, yet he knew that question asked by his friars was important. and he basically felt the need for them to learn this. So it's important to understand that these great saints sought perfection and worked on their imperfections and worked on their virtues to slowly build them and become productful. You know? Could you imagine St. Francis of Xavier, and he's a very sanguine person, being passionate about being a missionary and going all over the world. And then all of a sudden, after going to, let's say, India, he's like, I had enough of this. Okay? That's what sanguine people do. They start things and then they never finish it. They're like, okay, I'm not going to do this. This is too much of a bother. No. He acquired the virtue of persistence, perseverance. And he went not only to India to evangelize, but to Japan to evangelize, and is known to be the great evangelizer. Okay? You got, say, Ignatius of Loyola. Say, Ignatius of Loyola are doers. Okay? Can you imagine if he just did and he never knew what the meaning of what his doing was? To bring Christ into the world? You know, the Jesuits, which he founded, are known to started a lot of the school systems around the world. And so they had to know what the meaning of education's all about, to create the Christian man. And that came from St. Ignatius of Loyola. So they had to have pulled in and acquire these virtues. So God gives us these deficiencies so we can work on them and seek perfection. And in that process, we become holy. Not only holy, but in that process, we become productful. Productful to evangelize, productful to bringing Christ into the world, and productful even at work. You know, half of my job is helping my employees build virtue. Okay, and virtue is a natural thing. That I don't have to bring in religion or anything like that, because even pagans have virtue. Okay, so I mean, virtue comes from even Aristotle, to help them work on their virtues, so that they can actually become a better person. Okay, now I have to coach them. All right, but a person, the advantage we have as Catholics is that we don't need to be coached, because that's our directive. That is what we're supposed to be doing as Christians, is seeking Christian perfection so that we acquire these virtues to become the new man that God is calling us to be. Okay? So, one of the things that I like to do is I like to introduce next week's talk, where I'm going to actually talk about, still, it's a continuation of knowing yourself, okay? And so we wrap up this talk about the four temperaments that were described by Father Marin, who's taking them from St. Thomas Aquinas. Now remember, St. Thomas Aquinas lived 1,000 years ago. So the Catholic Church has known about these temperaments for 1,000 years. So this is not a new secret or a new idea. Myers-Briggs just came out, 50 years ago. The Catholic Church has been talking about temperaments for 1,000 years. So, but I'm going to bring out a new idea, and I call it a process type, that human beings, okay, not only do we have these temperaments, but we also have this, what I call process types. How people process things, okay? And I call it emotional process types versus cerebral process types. And so I'm going to be talking about that next week. It's going to be a topic, and we're going to go over it. I'm going to show by example, not just from a practical standpoint, but I'm going to show you from biblical standpoint how I came up with this idea, these two process types, because there are great examples of these two process types in the Bible. And I hope to explain that in next week, and that we will do that. Okay. So I highly encourage you to study the temperaments, figure out where you belong in those temperaments, and then use that to figure out what virtues and vices that you have that allows you then to seek perfection, to work on the virtues and eliminate those vices so that you can become, perfect. You can become this total man in doing that. And that's better than any self-help, okay? Because no self-help will work unless you work with this improve on your temperament. I've seen so many. Why do you think people start diets and then they quit? Why do you think people start exercising and they quit? Why do fads come in and go? Because people don't seek virtue. If you had all the good qualities of all these temperaments, these fads would not come and go. All right. That's when you can really, then once you have these virtues, then you can really, really work. And then you can get these self-help books and they will really work. Okay? Because you won't give up on the self-help books. And you'll be persistent and persevere. And you'll know what these things are, what those self-help books are really for. So analyze them, work on it, get your virtues, figure them out, and then work on them little by little. And then the next topic after this, I'll go into how do we acquire these virtues? Okay? How do we acquire these virtues? All right. So after the main topic of knowing thyself, which we're going to continue next week and possibly the week after that, we're going to go into, well, then how do I acquire these virtues? Okay. How do I do that? Okay. And it's not, it's a process, going to take a while, but there is a methodology, okay, in acquiring these virtues that not only were, methodologies that were devised by saints, but they were implemented by saints. And they were devised by saints and implemented by saints and endorsed by the Catholic Church. And they've been doing it for thousands of years. So this is not anything new. You would think that, they need to be changed. They didn't. It's the same thing. So why try to think of something new when the Catholic Church has literally thousands of years of experience on making saints through this methodology? So it's very simple. And we'll be talking about that after we finish knowing thyself. All right. So that wraps it up. So let's end it with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Lord Jesus, help us to understand our temperament. Help us to realize the good and the bad of our temperaments. Help us to seek perfection so that we may improve, become holy, and live with you in heaven for the rest of all eternity. As we pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Thanks for listening to me, David Cease at Practical Catholic. Here's a reflection for you. Take a moment and reflect, what is my predominant temperament, and what virtues can I work on to overcome my vices dominant in my temperament? Feel free to share your reflection or leave a comment on the podcast, Instagram, and Facebook at Practical Catholic, or visit my webpage at practicalcatholic1.com. Join me next week as we continue to discuss knowing ourselves and another way of understanding ourselves.
You're listening to WCAT Radio. the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.